Hey, welcome back. This is the Binge the Bible podcast that we've been doing during this series. It's been a lot of fun. We started with Genesis, oddly enough, because it's the first book in the Bible. Like Blake told us, you just open up past the table of contents, boom, there it is. And then we did an episode on Exodus. And then we are to what I think we would all agree, the most exciting book of the five, which is Leviticus.
Come
And
on.
Scotty, you taught this week. Amazing job. Loved it. Taught on
Yeah.
Leviticus. But I'd like to back up just a little bit before we dive into Leviticus, because we have talked on the podcast a couple of times about, why are we doing the Binge the Bible series? And you talked about it a bit on Sunday. But Scotty, I'd love to hear from you. What do you feel like is the value of this 5-week series that really we are skipping through five challenging books? What's the value of doing this?
Well, I said it yesterday, but I just sense a real hunger in people to know more about the Bible. We've been a church that's met people where they are, trying to help them take the next step all along the way. And we have people in our church that have been Christians for 50 years. We have retired pastors and seminary professors, but we have a lot of people who are brand new to faith, are coming back to faith. We have people who honestly don't know who Moses is or don't know the characters of the Old Testament. And I didn't grow up in church, so often I would go to church and be lost because I didn't know the story. And they would say things like, and I would say, no, I don't know. So in my conversations and relationships with people just outside of church, I think I said it yesterday, I probably had more spiritual conversations, Bible conversations in the last 40 days than I have in the last 4 years combined with people at the gym or neighbors or people I bump into. And so I just sense this real hunger to know more about scripture. And so we're trying to give an overview of these first five books of the Old Testament because they just set the tone for almost everything else that happens in the Bible about God's character and about how we see ourselves, a biblical worldview. And there's so much that Jesus does and talks about that you would get lost in or don't have the context for if you don't have these first five books of the Bible.
Yeah, I love that, Scotty, and you talked about many times that you didn't grow up in church. I grew up in church so much. My mom actually played the organ at our church the night I was born and was on the organ the next Sunday. So like I have never been not in church my entire life. Went to Bible college. I don't have an advanced degree like Dr. Blake, but I and yet, and I'm not just saying this, every week I have learned a ton. Like I've learned factually some things that Blake and Baird and then you, Scotty, have dug up, and then just some connections and things like that. It's been fascinating to me to take this kind of flyover of the Pentateuch or the Torah, the law. And this is a all skate, Scotty, you or Blake, but how do we get the most out of something like this? You talked about it a little bit yesterday, Scotty, but like how as a listener do I get the most out of this kind of series?
Well, I'm just looking at Blake and you see all those books behind him. He looks way smarter. The things he says are way smarter. So I'm just going to throw this one to Blake. Blake, what would you say on that? I mean, just based on your advanced degrees and your
Oh,
very
come on,
straight
stop it.
books.
Stop it. All it means is that I went to school a long time. I paid a lot of money. That's all it means. Um, and this series has been a great reminder for me, things I've forgotten, things I didn't know before to dig in. And so that would be my hope for our people is that they would dig in when they hear some of these things. They're like, wow, I had never considered that. I never heard of that before. I hope that that would create like you said, Scotty, that we already have the hunger, but it would create more hunger. It would give them a little bit more desire to read a little bit more. And so, yeah, I'd suggest jump into these some of these places in the Old Testament and read some of these stories. Ask some questions. Press in. Use some of the resources on our website. A great resource that sorry, I don't know if it's actually on our website, but it's gotquestions.org. It's a great website. So any of these little questions you have, you can punch in there and ask a little more. And then, like I try to always be available. So, reach out to any of us. We'd love to answer those questions. But to your point, yeah, I think you got to ask more questions yourself from the Lord. And I love that prayer that we pray every week at Journey. And so when you sit down to study this stuff, you don't just pray it on Sunday, but you can pray that prayer every time you sit down to read your Bible yourself. Say, Lord, speak to me because I'm reading this because I want to hear from you. And I really do believe God will do that. And I've been mentioning it a few times, but but just to watch some of the people in my world who are new to Christ and just coming to faith, and then just talking about um, their own journey of reading the Bible and having these aha moments of like, wow, I'd
Yeah.
heard that before, but then I read it. And when you see them read it for the first time, like you said, it creates, well, on one hand, it satisfies the hunger. On the other hand, it creates more hunger to know even more. And that's kind of our hope with this.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, the hunger part, and I don't know if this is accurate, but in my head, I was thinking kind of the goal of preaching isn't to just feed people, it's to make us hungry for more. And I
Yeah.
think this series is one of those. Um, you mentioned Got Questions. That's a great resource. I know on our website we have links to the Bible Project, and I go back to
Yeah.
Bible Project again and again
Yeah.
because they explain things in ways I understand. They also use illustrations which help me remember. And so through this series, I've gone back to Bible Project again and again. So Leviticus, we dove in. We kind of laughed about Leviticus, and it's not because it's not important. It is important. But I heard someone say that the whole Torah or the first 5 books of the Bible, especially Leviticus, it's kind of like a graduate level course. And so we're diving into graduate level, and some of us are freshmen. It's like walking into a 401 and you're expecting a 101. But there's something there for all of us. But I'm curious, Scotty, and I haven't asked you this, but I wonder if there's anything that you go, I wish I could have spent some more time. I had 30 minutes on Sunday. I wish I could have spent more time on this. Is there anything that you think about from Leviticus that
Yeah,
it would
I
have been
would
interesting to
say,
spend more time
and
on?
I kind of meant to say it yesterday. I like what you said about the graduate level course because I think a lot of Leviticus is written to the religious leaders, it's written to the priests because he's giving them very specific instructions. And so they're the ones who are modeling this to the people. And when people approached God and they approached with sacrifices or offerings, they're walking them through. It's not like they had a scroll that they took back to their tent to read. They're helping them process this. So it's in a small circle of people that are wrestling with this, and then they're helping the community understand that, which kind of goes back to the sermon idea that where we bring things out and we share them, but we're supposed to process that with a group of people. And that's why we're so big on small groups and getting people into groups and go, what did you think about this? It's how God speaks to us. When I was a young Christian, we only had paper Bibles back then. So I would literally circle verses in the Bible and put a question mark beside it. And the next time I saw a pastor or a mentor or somebody, I would go, what does this mean? And so a lot of our small groups should look like that. That doesn't really answer your question about what else I wish I could have talked about in Leviticus, other than it's really thick. There's lots of layers to it, and we can read commentaries and those kind of. I think God's designed us to be in the church together, processing that. I think one of to just keep going with that, and Blake, I'd love for you to jump in with this too, is because all of these principles, laws, are mixed in together. So we have ritual laws, and then we have moral laws, and then we have these civil laws. And it's just if you're reading through it as an average Christian, you go, well, which one of these am I supposed to continue to obey? We didn't have a lot of time to
Yeah.
dive into that. Is it okay to eat bacon? I mean, because I really like bacon. It's very good. It's
Yeah.
delicious.
Yeah.
But God says no. I'm a big seafood guy. A lot of people in our church have tattoos. My son has tattoos. Is that okay, or am I sinning? So I wanted more time to talk about that, but obviously there are 613, I think, laws in the Pentateuch, and so you don't really have the time to dive into each one of those. So Blake, what would you say about some of that?
Well, you said it well yesterday when you brought up and kind of alluded to the tattoo thing about, that these laws were. I really like how you said it, and you picked up on what Barron said the week before of these are people that had been in slavery in Egypt for all of these years, 400 years. And so uh, this process of coming out and being set apart, and I think if I can, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it said something about, it was getting Egypt out of them. That was the
Yeah.
process. And that these laws were trying to reformulate for them a new way of being devoted to God, set apart. And I don't think we often talk about that. About the nation of Israel being set apart, being God's chosen people. We say that phrase a lot, but why? Why were they chosen? They were supposed to be God's representatives. They were supposed to be God's representatives, and we would say it about us in our church today. Hopefully, we would say this about the people in our journey family: is that we are God's representatives, to use the Apostle Paul's terms. That we're ambassadors for Christ, that we represent Him everywhere we go. The idea would be that when people look at me, ultimately they should see God. Like when they look at my life, hopefully I reflect who Jesus Christ is. So part of all of those laws, part of all of this was trying to say that this is what you had been doing. And Scotty, you said it really well. There were sexual practices that they were doing that they were not they weren't God's best. I think you said it on Sunday, things that hurt women, they weren't the right things. And so God puts these new things into place. And you're right, some of those carry on, and then some of those were specific to the time. But uh, uh, it also this whole thing of getting Egypt out of them makes me go down another path that maybe we're too early to talk about it. Maybe we'll talk about it later. But let's just throw a teaser out there. It's true in our life, because when somebody becomes a follower of Jesus, and many of you at Journey, many of you watching the podcast are just new to all of this, and there's old ways that we used to live, things that we used to say. I was talking to somebody the other day about cussing. I can't stop cussing. It's just what I've done forever, you know? And part of that changes. This is what the person said to me. This is like, it just reminds me of what my mom used to tell me, is like, when I surround myself with the people who cuss, well, I'm probably going to keep cussing. But when I put a few new people in my life, uh, it changes the way that I talk. The point being is that when we come to Christ, we have this desire inside of us to act different, to think different, to live different. And God gives us these laws to say, not to take our joy away, but actually to show us the life that He intended us to have, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
That's good.
no, I was just going to say the whole piece that you're talking about. You talked about yesterday, Scotty. This whole idea of holiness, the holiness of God, and then being set apart. I think, and I wouldn't say this. This isn't an indictment on any specific church, especially not Journey, but I think in some ways we have kind of shied away from holiness, shied away from this separateness, this apartness, and Leviticus specifically really defines what it looked like for a nomadic tribe thousands of years ago to be set apart, separate. And while we're not following that same way of being separate, and of course we'll talk about it more, you talked about it, it's because of the cross, because of Jesus, that we have a different law written on our heart, Paul calls it. But I think really understanding how serious God takes this idea of holiness, of being separate, of being set apart, it helps us remember that didn't change. Like, we don't follow 613 laws, but we are a set apart people. We are a holy people that follow a holy God. And so I think that's important. A piece that's just sometimes can be really challenging. And Scotty, you hit it yesterday. You talked about substitutionary atonement, which, by the way, for those, like you said, I think one week, Blake, you talked about sanctification. Now we've hit substitutionary atonement. So for those people who love big words, like, we're getting into the big words, but this idea of substitutionary atonement and blood sacrifice for sin. And so I'd love to hear on that. So God's all powerful. He can do anything. He created the world. We read in Genesis. And then there's sin. It's, not doing what God's will, not doing what God's best for us. Couldn't He just say, you know what, guys, no worries, we're good. Like, I get it, you sinned, it's not great, but don't worry about it. Instead, there's this requirement for a blood sacrifice that a lot of Leviticus is about, and of course Jesus' sacrifice is about that. So why? Give me some ideas on why does God require this blood sacrifice to atone for sin?
Yeah, I think I would jump in with just a couple of thoughts of there is always this tension between God's justice and God's mercy, and that we don't want a God who is not just. If you have been harmed or your family has been harmed in any way and you walk into a courtroom and the judge says, you can go. There's not a person that I know who would say, well, that's good. He's a good judge. He's good and fair and righteous.
Yeah.
And so that's the nature of God, is that he cannot bend on his justice or he would not be God. But there is the tension of love and mercy. It's imagining that the person standing before the judge is your child, and that yes, the law must be held to account. There must be justice, but I also love this person in front of me and I want to find a way for forgiveness. But the penalty for sin was separation and death. So God is making a way for this for the sin to be paid for. It will either be paid for by the sinner or the substitute. And that is the beginning of Leviticus. There's also this idea of progressive revelation, that God
Yeah.
begins there and ultimately it will end in Jesus, that Jesus will be the final and full sacrifice.
Mhm.
So to continue the illustration, the judge steps from behind the bench, pays the penalty, but pays it himself. And he becomes the sacrifice and takes the place for the sin. So this progressive, it begins with lambs and bulls and goats, but it ends with Jesus paying the price. So um, that's a lot of word salad, but I think that that's the initial thoughts that I have. Blake, Jeff, how does that
Yeah,
hit you?
you're 100%. You're right on, and you said that really well yesterday. I thought the whole thing about bringing. I love how you took, even though the atonement's in the middle, you took it and you put it at the end because it is the story of it's the fulfillment. And I think of that verse. There's a verse in Galatians, I believe it's chapter 3, that says that the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ, or it was. I think the word is like it's our schoolmaster, our custodian, meaning that all these laws, all these things that they were supposed to obey, ultimately would lead them to a place where they realized we could never actually keep this law perfectly. Like, and I'm tired of trying to keep it perfectly. I keep messing up. And I can't bring enough animals, and I, I can't ever be completely holy and completely cleansed, because as soon as I go and offer a sacrifice, well, guess what? Tomorrow, the next day, next week, next Sunday, next month, next year, I got to keep doing it. And then in Galatians says that that's the whole idea of that. God, in a sense, was kind of like, well, I'm gonna let them figure it out over a long, like you said, Scotty, progressive revelation over a long period of time, that they could really never quite get it right on their own. And so I would send Jesus to be the Lamb of God, the perfect sacrifice, the one who would die once for all for the sins of the people. I actually was reading in Hebrews this morning, or where I am in my Bible reading, probably where you might be, and just talking about that. Sorry, I'm switching to this other piece, but it has the same point, that he talks about that Jesus is the perfect priest because he's eternal and that he lives forever, and that those animal sacrifices in Leviticus, once they were dead, they were dead. And now you needed to get, as you said really well yesterday, Scotty, that the point of that was to cover our sin, to cover, to hold off God's wrath, to hold off God's judgment. But Jesus comes, and when he gives his life and he sheds his blood, he washes us clean. He doesn't just, yes, he covers us, but he also washes us clean. He doesn't just hold off God's wrath. You said it so well right there. He actually took God's wrath. The animals couldn't take God's wrath. The animals would only cover and be a temporary, holding off God's wrath until Jesus would ultimately take God's wrath. And that's just amazing to get your head around that God would send his own son, his son. Going back to what we talked about in Genesis, when Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac, it was a foreshadowing of what would ultimately happen. And it's just amazing how all of this leads to the person of Christ. And I was talking to somebody in the lobby at Lone Tree yesterday at our Lone Tree location, who is new to all of this. And I just said to them, wow, you're new to all this. And here you came to lay, how did it go? What was it like? And they basically just said, I'm not going to quote them perfectly, but they'd said, I liked how Scotty wrapped it up at the end and brought it back to Jesus. And here's a person who I'm not even sure they're following Jesus yet, but they were able to understand that this all connects to Jesus, even as somebody who's brand new to this. I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah. So good. And I think we talked about digging in more, and Blake, you just mentioned it. Like Hebrews is the twin book in the New Testament for Leviticus.
Yeah.
It's how it's the bookends. This
Yeah.
is how it started, and here's how Jesus. So if you're interested in that, you should go read Hebrews after you've read Leviticus.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you brought Hebrews in. I love you brought Galatians in. You can't really understand Galatians without getting kind of an understanding of where did circumcision come from and what's that about, because Paul talks about it over and over and over again, and it just brings a richness to our faith. And back to the original thing you guys we talked about was this blood sacrifice for sin. It's hard to understand. I think the Jewish people of that time, they understood the seriousness of sin, because when you have to bring a goat, you have to bring a lamb, you have to bring one, as you
Yeah.
said, Scotty, you raised as, and for some, they didn't have, 100 sheep. They maybe had 5 sheep, and they had to bring one of them and then be a part of the sacrifice. You walk away from that going, God takes sin very seriously. It matters. And it's part of this whole holiness thing. And like you said, he's not a judge that's going to go, don't worry about it, because he's a just God and a loving God. And I think sometimes for me, maybe for others, I miss the seriousness of sin. Like, it's not a big deal. Hey, God, forgive me, I did that. That's just kind of how I am. No, that's sin. Jesus died. He died for that sin. And so, again, diving back into the law, the Leviticus law, helps us see that seriousness. I want to just, and we don't need to spend any time on this, but there's a piece that obviously there was no time to hit yesterday, but it's fascinating to me. If you read the 25th chapter of Leviticus, and sometimes I had a Bible professor told me one time it's not immoral to skim some of the Old Testament. Like, it's okay. Like the 15th verse about leprosy in a house, you can kind of begin to skim. But you get toward the end of Leviticus, and in Leviticus 25, there's this thing called the year of Jubilee. And you guys just have to put up with me for just a minute, because it's way off topic. But there's this description of an economic system that is brilliant. And it says that every 50th year, after 49 years, these things are to happen. There's a proclamation of liberty. Everyone's free. There's a restoration of property. If you have bought family property from someone else during that 49 years, in the 50th year, you give it back to them. So that was what wealth was family. A family's property was their wealth. And Moses allotted the tribes these pieces of property. And the year of Jubilee said, all that property just resets every 50 years. And so if you buy a piece of property in the 49th year, it's really cheap, because you only get it for a year. And it was a whole system built around this whole idea of servants and workers. At the end of 49 years, they're all set free. And so there are no servants in the 50th year. And the land is rested. Like, we didn't figure this out for many, many centuries, that God gave a farming technique that we use today. He said, rest the land. It's going to be good for the land. You're going to be taken care of. It's this fascinating economic system, justice system. Here's what's fascinating to me, because I've read about this, researched it. As far as we know, they never did it. That it's never been done. There's no biblical record of it. There's no historical record of it. And I think that's fascinating. I wonder and you may not have any thoughts on that. I just wanted to say, dive into Leviticus 25, read that system. If you're like me, you like economics, you like studying politics, things like that, and think about what would be the implications. We're not going to get into all of that, but any thoughts? Why? Right in this law, they obeyed these laws. They were so careful about these laws. There was this huge thing they never did. Any thoughts about that, or observations how that might apply to what we do today?
I mean, I think, like a lot of things, every Sunday I'll say something, or a pastor will say something from the stage and go, "That's a great idea, man. In concept, I think we're going to go home and do that." And then 50 years later, they went, no way we're doing this, because then
Hmm.
that means I got to give this up. Or we're talking about human heart. And it's one of the reasons why Jesus talks about money and possessions and economic systems a lot, because they have this way of weaving their way around our soul, because this is where we get our security and our value. So I mean, it's a simple answer, but I think they thought this is a great concept. And then they got to the moment where we're like, oh, I'm going to have to give up what I'm secure with. I'm going to have to trust God this year and not plant. I'm going to have to, oh, we've owned this land for 20 years. I don't even remember not owning this land. And so it's a massive spiritual exercise. I also think I mean, it has like, there are implications we could build into our system. I don't think God's asking us to do that today, but things like we're trusting God with our generosity, or we trust him for our provision, or when he asks us to do things. So those are just first thoughts off the top of
One
my
one
head.
of the one of the things that I just comes to my mind about this whole 50 years deal, and I think you're right, Jeff, that we don't see, if as far as I know, reading the Old Testament, they never practiced this year of Jubilee. God puts it in place, but they ever, they did some of that, but they never really, that we're aware of, that they practiced this year of Jubilee, giving it all back. So, but you also think about these people, and you read the Old Testament, and this prophet to this king, uh, how many of us have read the Bible? Even those of us who haven't read the Bible a lot could say, like, this guy followed God, but then the next guy didn't, and the next guy didn't, and the next guy didn't, but then the next guy did, and the next guy didn't. My point being is 50 years is the next generation.
Hmm.
And we all are sitting here as grandfathers, granddads, whatever your grandpa name is. Um, and so it would be
Fair.
like, yeah, Bear, granddad. What do you got,
Papa,
Jeff? Papa. Okay.
Papa.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so, but think about that. It would be like us passing it on to our kids so they could pass it on to their kids. And so maybe the year of Jubilee never happened because they didn't pass down their belief system from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. Because too often in the Old Testament, we read, I mean, page after page, chapter after chapter, book after book, have these people who walked away from God, they forgot the law. We just went through this huge study in the book of Nehemiah where God told them, this is what's going to happen to you. And they were in exile. And then they went back, and God kept his promise. And one of the things about this year of Jubilee that's just beautiful is it's a reminder of who God is. God has this pattern of grace and restoration, all the way from the fall to the Noah's Ark, to what he does with Abraham, to what he does with Joseph, to what he does in Exodus, to where he is in Leviticus. His presence is coming. What Scotty talked about on Sunday, God's presence is coming, showing a way for us to have a restored relationship with God. God's all about restoration. And that's what he intended by this thing of Jubilee. He wanted restoration of the land, restoration of debts. But I don't know. That's just one thing that crosses my mind. But maybe they just couldn't pass it on from one generation to the other. I don't know.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I love that. I think, Scotty, what you were saying about application today is trusting God. Like if we're generous, God's going to bless that. That the Jubilee was just about faith. It was about trusting God. And there was I'm not saying I would be able to do it. Like if they said, if you came and said, hey, Jeff, end of 2025, that's 49 years. So give your land or give your house back to who owned that land 50 years ago, and God will take care of you. I would be like, I'm going to go with no. Like, I'm just going to go with my plan
Hmm.
here. But it's interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend who is a committed Christian, been around church for a long time. And they were talking about another friend, a mutual friend. And they said, yeah, this person called me and they are right now living a lifestyle that doesn't really follow some of the biblical things that we believe, that we know. And they were saying to me, I bet people think really bad about me about this. And my friend told this mutual friend, you know what? Don't worry about what other people think. It makes you happy. That's all that matters. And I thought we live that way so much. Like God gives us principles. Leviticus is for Old Testament, but there's so many principles in the New Testament and Ephesians and Galatians and all of that about this is how you live in a way that God blesses, right? And we go, yeah, that sounds good, like you said, Scotty, but I got a better idea. And I think that's what Israel said is, like you said, 49 years later, they're like, yeah, that all sounded good, but we've got a better idea. And they never experienced, and the world doesn't know what would a nation look like if it actually followed this plan in Leviticus 25.
Mhm.
Hey, there's a couple more things. This is, man, I would love to just hang out and keep talking Old Testament law and what it means and all of that. It's fascinating to me. But the important thing is, Scotty, you connected Leviticus to Jesus. And I'd love to talk a little bit about what is the importance in my faith to understand that connection between the law, between the Torah and Jesus. Like, is that important for me to know as I grow in my faith?
Yeah, I think so. It's hard. I mean, I had a conversation with a lady in the atrium who said, "Hey, thanks for sharing some of that today because I've always had trouble with this saving idea. Like, what am I saved from?" And I think it's really important. The gospel means good news, but there's really no good news without bad news. The reason why the gospel is so
Good point.
good is because I realize my condition, that I have sinned, that I've separated myself from God, that the message of the gospel is not that bad people need to be made better, but that dead people need to be made alive. And
Mhm.
so Jesus is becoming my sin, covering my sin, cleansing me, all of this restoring me in a right relationship with God. And then all of the laws and the principles and the things that we're talking about, it goes from for to from. Like sometimes we think about the Bible as I need to do these things for God so that I get God's approval and I'm in his good graces. But then you flip it in the New Testament, and now I live this way from grace, from what God's done to me. And that's what God was trying to communicate to them. Hey, I've rescued you from Egypt. I've set you on a new path. But if we can start living like that, there's a lot of freedom in that. And we don't judge other people because they're not doing it. We're just saying, Jesus has saved me, he set me free, and now because of that, I live a different way. I experience life in a different way. So I think connecting the dots between those two things helps make Jesus, his message come alive in our lives.
It,
Yeah, that's
I, Blake, did you have something? I'm sorry.
no. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, and we're all, I know, on the same page here. I don't have to understand Leviticus to follow Jesus. I don't have to
Right.
be able
Right.
to recite 613 laws to be a Christ follower.
Right.
But as I understand, like you said, Scotty, as I understand the bad news, good news, the connection between the law and Jesus, it just helps me grow in my faith. It helps me better understand. We would never put a barrier of, until you have read the first 5 books of the Old Testament and really understood them, then come talk to us about following Jesus. That's the opposite of what Paul said. You mentioned Blake Galatians. Like Paul said to the Galatians, why in the world are you letting people put the law as a stumbling block between
Yeah.
you and Jesus? But it does give us depth. I want to talk about just one more thing before we go. It was
Hey,
this
before
one.
we do that,
Yeah.
here's one thing I think about is you guys know I'm a massive football fan. And so I watch football all the time. And then I raise my son to do that. And because we both played and all those kinds of things, we see things in the game that my daughter-in-law doesn't see. My daughter-in-law, she tolerates football. And she says things like, why don't they just run around them? Like, I don't understand. Like, why are they letting them tackle them? Why they just go right up the middle? But the game, when you watch it, the more you know, the more the intricacies and the plays and the here's what's going to happen, and it I just enjoy it more. Oh, I see the layers of it, and I think a lot of times when you become a student of the Bible and you see all these different pieces, you connect dots and you enjoy the bigger story of God. So
Yeah.
we
So
So
couldn't have
good.
a podcast without me interjecting
some
something
football. I love it.
about
Some
football.
football.
And that's
Exactly.
really
Yeah.
good analogy, Scotty. So much that it's to your benefit. In other words, you get more out of it. So the more you
Right.
understand this Old Testament stuff, it just helps that when you get to the New Testament, you just get a little bit more out of it. Colors it in, goes from a black and white photo to a color photo. It makes a lot more sense. And I was thinking, like even you get into, I may not get this verse exactly right, but you get in the beginning of it's either Matthew or Luke. I think it's Luke, where Jesus has this deal where he goes into the temple and he reads this passage from Isaiah, and he sits down. And he says, "Hey, this is fulfilled today in me." Of course, it blows their mind. They get all upset about it. But one of the things that he says is that I came to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And if I understand that right, that also could be, Jeff, back to your question about your year of Jubilee thing, that could be the fulfillment. And so here again, the connection between knowing some of these things from the Old Testament, so that when you read the New Testament and Jesus says that, you're like, oh, so yeah, they never were able to to practice this year of Jubilee, but Jesus ultimately fulfills it because he's ultimately going to restore. He's ultimately, and that's what heaven's about one day. One day, heaven's going to be all about restoration. It's going to be about making all things new. And Jesus comes to say, "Hey, I am that, and I'm the door. I'm the
Yeah.
way to get there where we're all headed." So,
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love that. I love that. At the end, Scotty, you gave us this week several things that connecting Jesus to what we talked about in Leviticus. One of them that stood out to me was Jesus restores us into God's presence. And as you said that, I thought back, Blake, to your message, the Garden of Eden, every evening, face to face with God, being in God's presence, not being ashamed, being able to sit down with God and asking him, "Hey, so how does that work?" And God can explain it face to face. And I just thought that is such a incredible picture of that's what Jesus does. The scapegoat, the lambs that they sacrificed, like you said, Blake, they could cover sin, but they didn't restore us into God's presence. And we're just a little teaser here. Our next series we're calling Home for Christmas as we get ready for the Christmas season. We have obviously 2 more weeks of this series, Numbers and then Deuteronomy. But that whole idea of Home for Christmas is this idea of what does it mean to come back into God's presence? We have this longing to return to the Garden of Eden. And Leviticus gave a map that didn't get there. And faith in Christ brings us into God's presence. So I got to preach my sermon today. That was fun. Thank you for letting me do
That's
that.
good.
Let me just say before we finish, any last thoughts? Any other thoughts about Leviticus? We probably will never get a chance to do a whole episode on the book of Leviticus again. So any other thoughts you want to throw out?
No, I think is a fantastic dive because into it. And I'm happy for the people who were here and reading and studying that. And I think it, for us as church leaders and pastors, just every piece of the scripture matters and it's pointing toward Jesus. So for my people who are listening to this and at our church, I just want you to think every time you're reading the Bible, whether it's Proverbs or Ecclesiastes or Leviticus, I want you always to be thinking, how does this point to Jesus? What is this about? How does it get me closer to Jesus? And if you do that, that's your filter, you're probably going to come out on top.
So good. So good. Hey guys, thanks for listening. Again, as I told you, there's 2 more episodes in this podcast. I encourage you to go back, listen to Genesis and Exodus, some fun stuff that we did there. Also, if you go to journeycolorado.com, there are some great resources there that we mentioned today to continue your Bible study. But hey, we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.